Before we begin, a quick note. Everything you hear on this podcast is for educational purposes only. It is not medical advice, and it's not a substitute for the guidance of your doctor, your pharmacist, or your healthcare team. So if you have questions about your medications, your diet, your health, please speak with your healthcare provider. Now let's get into it. If you're new here, welcome. Hit subscribe right now so you can never miss an episode. We release new episodes, new conversations regularly, and every single one could change the way you think about your health. So you can subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Amazon, or wherever you're listening right now. You can check pharmaplansystem.com/podcast. She was 19 years old, stage 4 ovarian cancer. It was a terminal prognosis. The doctors told her she had months to live. That was in 1991. She's still here. And what she did between that diagnosis and today, that is what this entire episode is about. We spent season 1 of this podcast exploring how food and medicine interact. We talked about pharmacists who catch the interactions nobody else sees. We talked about infections that change how your body absorbs medication. We talked about GLP-1 drugs, kidney transplants, diabetes reversal, and the government policies that quietly shape what ends up on your plate. But this episode, this one, is where all of those threads come together. Because my guest today did not just study the relationship between food and cancer, she lived it. And she built a clinical practice around it. She wrote the book that oncology dietitians and integrative medicine practitioners carry with them. And today, Dr. Nasha Winters is a naturopathic oncologist, a fellow of the American Board of Naturopathic Oncology, and the co-author of The Metabolic Approach to Cancer. And she's worked with over 10,000 patients across 30 years. And she was one of them first. So this episode is for every patient who's ever been told that food does not matter once you have a cancer diagnosis. It is for every caregiver who wants to do more. It is for every clinician who knows there's more to the story than the standard protocol. Welcome to season 1, episode 12 of When Food Meets Medicine. I'm your host, Dr. Remi Olukoya, pharmacist, who believes that what you eat is just as important as what you're prescribed and that the two are inseparable. This is the season 1 finale, and I want to take just a moment. Thank you for every message, every share, every question you sent in. Season 1 took us through some extraordinary conversation. So we are here today. Season 1 has been about one thing: the space between food and medicine that nobody talks about enough. And today for the finale, we're going to do a deep dive. The deepest part of that space, we're talking about cancer. And I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Nasha Winters to the show. Dr. Nasha Winters is a naturopathic oncologist, a fellow of the American Board of Naturopathic Oncology, and the co-author of The Metabolic Approach to Cancer, a book that has become a cornerstone text in integrative oncology. She's worked with over 10,000 patients in 30 years of clinical practice, and she began this work not in a clinic, but in a hospital bed at 19 years old with a terminal diagnosis. And Dr. Nasha, welcome to When Food Meets Medicine.
Wow. Well, thank you for the beautiful introduction, but more so, thank you for your season. I'm so blown away by the conversations you've already had. You're just getting warmed up. I can't wait to see what season 2 is bringing.
Thank you so much. Thank you
Amazing.
for the honor. I like the fact that the idea that your body always tries to heal. I think I've heard that from you. The moment you decide to ask a different question, and I know normally that is the spirit of this show. So we're going to start with the foundation, because I want our listeners to understand what is meant by metabolic approach, because it's not a phrase most people hear from their oncologists. So
Sure. Well, the metabolic approach, simply is that there are so many folks who, when you hear the word metabolic, they think maybe your calorie in, calorie out in your body composition. Like that's where we kind of have been trained into that idea. But metabolic is so so much more than that. And I think starting this conversation out with this question, Dr. Remi, is so perfect because it lays the foundation of every single thing we're going to discuss today. So when I'm talking about metabolic, I mean, yes, your metabolic rate and your calorie in, calorie out has some influence here. But what we truly understand is our metabolic health is at its very foundation, at its very core, dependent on our mitochondrial health. And so let me give a little more framework here so folks can catch up with me as to where you're going to take us today. These little guys, these little mighty mitochondria that many of us learned about in maybe sixth grade biology, all of us were taught that their sole purpose was to create energy, specifically ATP. And so, yes, they do that. But in recent years and recent decades, we've learned that they do so much more. And this is where the metabolic mitochondrial interface takes place. So simply put, yes, mitochondria do create energy. They are an energy exchange system. But even more importantly, and why this is so critical for our conversations today, given that more than 93% of Americans, and likely true for all developed countries globally, are considered metabolically broken. Okay, so when that lands, that should kind of shake your cells up a little bit. But specifically, there are three main jobs that you might not have heard of before that the mitochondria is responsible for. So I want to get my notes in front of me because I do not want to flub this incredibly important conversation. And I also know we have a lot to cover. So let me kind of frame this in a way that, again, we were taught that mitochondria are the powerhouse, the little batteries of our cells. Yes, and there are three things also happening simultaneously that we're aware of now and will likely learn more. Bit of context, mitochondria were originally bacteria. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years ago. There are some that theorize that they've been around for as long as 170 to 200,000 years. And they started out as these little bacterial microorganisms that later joined forces with us. Our bodies today take up upwards, depending on the studies and depending on the body composition, upwards of 20%. I mean, that's just incredible to me. So when you think about it, we have a lot of bacteria made from these ancient mitochondria that are part of us that we have co-evolved with for thousands and thousands of years. So yes, they are an energy exchange, but they are more importantly sensors. They are constantly reading the environment, the terrain, how much sugar, how much oxygen, how much light, how much inflammation. Is it day? Is it night? Am I stressed? What did I just eat today? Those are information inputs that the mitochondria are constantly scanning for. Number two, they're translators. They then take that information that they sensed into a language that the cell can understand. That language are metabolites. Okay, so things like acetyl-CoA, succinate, alpha-ketoglutarate, the NAD/NADH ratio, basically biochemistry as a primary language here. And these little molecules walk over to the DNA and help them decide which genes switch on and which genes switch off. And so this engine talkback is like a boardroom that is responsive to the signals, the sensing that comes in, and then the translation that happens. The third piece, which is really critical, is the responders or the communicators. So based on the information coming in, based on the interpretation, they then tell the terrain or the environment around their inner cells, their outer cells, their other cells, their tissues, their organs, their construct, and even outside of our body, they tell our body what to do next. Do you want them to build? Do you want it to divide? Do you want it to hide, burn fat, hoard sugar, survive at all costs, or die on purpose, something known as apoptosis? So I want you guys to understand that this is truly what metabolic health is. How well are your sensing agents? How well are your translating agents? How well are your responding agents? That is then what leads to proper creation of energy. The energy is like the side effect or the downstream effect. The ATP production is the downstream effect of those three things happening in the mitochondria that we've all kind of thought was the whole enchilada. It's actually an expression. So you can send the same distressing signal long enough, such as chronic insulin, chronic inflammation, low oxygen, no sleep, And the mitochondria do what a good sensor would do. They adapt, and they often will adapt into survival mode. And survival mode, run long enough, is the concerning cancering phenotype. That cell isn't betraying the body. It's literally obeying the message the body keeps sending.
Wow. I love the way you framed it, and I'm learning. I knew I was going to learn on this episode, and I do hope a lot of people. I like the way you break it down, where it's understandable. So I'm going to start with something. I think we spoke about this when we had our conversation.
Yeah.
Warburg effect, because I think that is the piece that most patients never hear.
Exactly.
And I want you to explain it in plain language, just like you did, what it means that cancer cells behave differently metabolically, because you've given us the background.
Exactly.
And why does that matter for someone? What does that matter for what someone would eat?
Perfect. Well, first, I'm really glad that you gave me the opportunity to create the foundation, the framework, because what Dr. Otto Warburg was observing back in the early 1920s is now, today, what we're understanding through a different lens. Simply put, at the time, so in 1914, a Dr. Theodore Bovary was a doctor who saw cancer as a genetic disease. They classified it as a somatic mutation process, a genetic disease, which caught a lot of attention of a lot of the scientists and clinicians of the time. But a few short years later, the sort of controversial Dr. Otto Warburg, by the way, if you want to read more on this fascinating man, there's a book called Ravenous by Sam Apple that does a beautiful historical perspective that reads very layperson friendly. It's not total science geeky, but it's
we'll
a
put in our
fascinating
show
story.
notes. Definitely.
Yes, please do, because it really gives you a construct of what was happening at that time that literally unfolded to how we think and see cancer today and metabolic health today. But the Warburg effect at that time, we didn't have the same types of equipment, things we have today. We've gotten much more sophisticated with that. But the Warburg effect of then and now is, simply put, Dr. Otto Warburg noted that the mitochondria in cancerous tissue looked very different than the mitochondria in healthy tissue. Very simply thought. And that caused, like, every single sample he took, looked like he saw this continuum of a difference in the mitochondria. In the healthy tissue, they were kind of plump and numerous and highly active, whereas in the cancerous tissue, they were kind of shriveled up. They kind of looked like little raisins, mismatched, torn apart, not as many of them, and not as very activated. And so he started to explore deeper into this. And in fact, his understanding of cancer as a mitochondrial metabolic disease shined brighter than the Theodore Bovary somatic mutation disease, and did so for the next 30, 40 years until the helix, the DNA helix, was discovered. And then it's like we forgot everything we'd learned, threw that information out, and went down the rabbit hole of genetics again. And that's where we are still predominantly staying, which unfortunately, I will tell you right now, is not correct. In fact, a couple of years ago, a study came out saying that really the nail has been slammed into the coffin of the genetic mutation theory of cancer, and that we're finally having a bigger, incredible discussion about this as a metabolic mitochondrial disease. So Otto Warburg saw these cancer cells fermenting sugar into something known as lactate, even when there was oxygen freely available in the system. It was like running the generator, the emergency generator, when the lights are already on. It's like a strange, excess behavior. His conclusion was that cancer is, at its root, a disease of broken mitochondria. And I've kind of explained to you what we've now learned, that yes, that was part of the story, but not the whole story. The field was shelved, as I said, for decades because the gene people started to win the argument, and because cancer became a disease of mutations, full stop. And unfortunately, is still predominating belief system in oncology, which is probably why we're not having the outcomes that we would hope for. So now that we know that both of these theories were half right, because guess what? When the mitochondria are damaged, they can no longer do their job of protecting the DNA. So yes, you can get a genetic mutation, but it too is a downstream effect and not the starting point. So talk about a flip in our thought process. So the mitochondria in most cancer cells aren't broken. They're reporting the information as they're being delivered it. So the fermentation isn't a malfunction, it's a strategy. And in 2011, Hanahan and et al. Put out a paper called Reprogramming Energy Metabolism focused in oncology. And it was formally making this process a cancer hallmark. So basically, Warburg conversation came back onto the table in about 2011. It's not that long. He had a big gap. He was on a holiday for a big time. So mitochondria are not just energy factories. As I said, they're listening posts. And the reframing it as understanding that way is how you can start to think about this. And so unfortunately, we lost a lot of really valuable time and energy, but there's a lot of scientists and researchers around the world who are dusting off this old information and building upon it. Because of course, in 1921, by the way, this man won a Nobel Prize for his work. This is not esoteric or woo-woo, but it's something that he had some of the information, but we didn't have the technologies or the know-how to understand what we understand today.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I want to pick on a particular thing you said, which I like that. When we say cancer cells they use sugars. I know you mentioned sugars are preferentially using glucose for fuel. So even when oxygen is available, that is not just a biology lesson. That is practical implication for what someone puts on their plate. And yet most oncology appointments never touch that. So what do you think? Why do you think that gap exists? Why?
So here's what's very interesting. There was another doctor in 1909 by the last name of Moreschi, Moreschi. And from the early 1900s up until the mid 1960s, we routinely fasted our patients going through a cancerous process. And yet someone along the way, sometime in the mid 60s, said, how dare we do that to people who are so struggling? Tell them to eat whatever they want. And no matter, just don't let them lose weight. Well, 1960, that might have looked a little different. But today, when 93% of us are broken and 70% of us are obese and 30% of those are morbidly obese, losing weight is actually a strategy to both treat and prevent cancer. And so what is at the end of the fork, or what's even not on the plate at all, can have a huge impact. So part of my belief system is that, first of all, clinicians historically, and this is changing thanks to some new law that are being passed, but historically less than 25% of all medical schools even offered an elective course in nutrition. And it was basic, if that. I mean, literally, you could have learned more about nutrition from a Cosmopolitan magazine article than you could have from a medical school training. And if it's an elective course, if you're a clinician who's, literally a student in med school, think about what it was like for you in pharmacy school, my school, like you don't have the bandwidth to take an elective course, right? So it's not something that one ran into willingly. By the way, the requirements are now changing. They will be required to have 40 hours, which, by the way, as a naturopathic doctor, I had 300 hours of nutrition, just an FYI. But 40 hours is still a huge improvement over zero. Okay.
Way difference.
A big difference. So I think that there's part of the issue is that there was no training in this. And then we've had industry tell us how to eat for the past 40 or 50 years, which is where we got into trouble with telling people that things like eggs and butter that our grandparents, great-grandparents, and great-great-grandparents have been eating since the beginning of time, shouldn't be eating, and that we blamed fat where sugar was really the problem. In fact, there were a handful of scientists who were paid handsomely, what would be upwards of hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's pricing, to suppress the story that sugar was actually the problem in the 1960s. And we then went in to demonize fat. And we then went in to then turn that into the selling of things like Crisco and canola, which there is no place in nature or human evolution that have utilized these types of oils and the seed oils that would follow, and even the things like the high fructose corn syrup that would later come out. We started to industrialize our food systems, and we started to write research articles and support, like putting ADA, so American Dietetic Association, stamps of approval on things like boxes of Cheerios, which are pretty much little glyphosate inner tubes of food for us to ingest. So we had industry telling us how this was done. And literally, you can look at graph after graph after graph to see that the way we started to eat post-World War II directly coincided with the way our health crashed. And we continue to still blame certain things that were never the problem. Never the problem. In fact, we had two moments in science where in the world wars, we had to ration things like sugar and bread. And our health in the midst of world wars with extreme stress, we actually thrived more in our physical health and well-being than we did in the times of peace. And so when we took the bread off the table and the sugar bowls off the table, and we actually probably did a little bit of caloric restriction or intermittent fasting, and unintentionally, our health actually improved. And so these are the things that we stopped asking questions about or getting curious about. And so when we talk about this nutrition piece, there's a lot more to it than just we didn't understand the whole story. We've understood the whole story, but we've had industry getting in the way of us being able to tell it effectively.
Very interesting.
It is.
I want to make sure our listeners really hear you. I like the fact that our diets have to improve. It is not that the diet cures cancer.
Thank you.
It is that the metabolic environment, the terrain, it's either it supports it or it undermines everything else you're doing. So including your treatment, which is it's fundamentally different, and it's one thing that I think every patient deserves to understand before they even start treatments.
Yeah.
So back to you. Can you tell me about a patient, and you don't need to name names or anything like that, where addressing the terrain changed the outcome in a way that even surprised you?
Well, let me give a little more context before I tell that story, because I think that you just stimulated a thought that I would love to carry on, which I think is really good here, that there is no single bad meal that starts this process, right? There's a concept of a drift, a metabolic drift. So that day after day, month after month, year after year, insults or input into the mitochondria is what hands the mitochondria the input. And then the mitochondria faithfully adjust their signal to match that, adapt that over time until the whole metabolic set point slides into a place that can cause harm and not health. So it's far enough down the road that a cell, when it flips into a phenotype of Warburg effect, it starts to utilize fuel differently in the cancer cells than it does in the healthy cells. So it's not that sugar, to Dr. Remy's point, causes cancer, but the accumulated assaults to our mitochondria from things we'll talk about here in a moment, my concept of the terrain 10, not just food, impact how those mitochondria respond, translate, and move about the building. So that's really important to know. So let's talk about an example. And I'm not going to give one client example because my work started on groups of clients' examples, which is when in 2009, my husband and I started to run women. At that time, they were women in cancer retreats. And we would basically take women out of their environment on a Friday afternoon at 4 p.m. and send them back home on a Monday morning after 10 a.m. And prior to them coming to that event, we would do a set measure of labs. And in 2009, we were also starting to get access to things like single nucleotide polymorphism testing. So my husband and I were some of the early adopters of using that type of testing in our practice because it also tells me what foods will help this person thrive or die. So we were taking in data about these patients. We were bringing them into a contained environment where we were in charge of the signals being given to the mitochondria for a period of days, from everything from light to food to connection to nature time. We were helping all of the signals coming into the system. And then after the retreat was over, we would retest them. But during that time, we were very intentional of having them eat within a time restricted, and we weren't explaining this to them ahead of time. We were just doing it. So we were putting them into an imposed, without them even being aware of it, time restricted eating window. We were eating within an 8-hour window of those days. So all of them were in essence fasting a little bit. And we were very thoughtful about the food that we fed them. It was local, seasonal, regional, as close to source and as clean as absolutely possible. It wasn't even about what they were eating. It was the quality of it and when they were eating. And even folks like Dr. Sachin Panda's book, Circadian Code, he even suggests that when we eat is just as critical, and we'll talk some chronobiology here in a bit, as to what we eat. So this was things that we started seeing in mass not a one-off, not anecdotal.
Mm.
We were seeing we could literally change those metabolic switches within literally 4 days, and it would have stay effect. And these clients could then see for themselves how bad or how expressive their labs were beforehand and how much they
And
changed in such a short window, which really inspired an ongoing decision to return back to this approach that was clearly giving them leverage against the cancer and against all chronic disease and allowing them to respond better to whatever treatments they were on, standard of care or otherwise. And it became the foundation, which would later become my book. So the book, Metabolic Approach to Cancer, that was published May 2017, was built on, oh my gosh, almost 20 years of data, right? So that book is basically the love letter to all of the people that informed this understanding. And mind you, this work we were doing, these retreats, was 2 full years before anybody really started talking about the metabolics of cancer. So we were already in the field living it ourselves and applying it to other people, collecting that data, informing our understanding, then finding research to back it. And since that book came out in 2017, almost a decade ago, it's astonishing. We could have 3 volumes of this book now because of the amount of data that has come out to support everything I'm discussing here.
It is remarkable. It is the retreat for me. I think when we first spoke about it was so eye-opening, so important.
Yeah.
And having that data and for people to really see there's a difference in hearing things, there's a difference in seeing things and seeing the difference of where I started from, where I'm headed to, and I'm heading in the right direction. So it's, but no, it's true because I think when I first heard it, it was mind blowing for me that you take people out of their normal environment, you take away everything they used to. It's like you're messing with people's system in a good way. And, you're like, we're going to start afresh. We're going to try this and see if it works. And the data shows it because there's a test before and there's a test after. And what strikes me as a pharmacist is that, one, we're trained to think about the drug first and the patient second. What you're describing is totally the opposite.
Exactly.
You start with the terrain and the treatment follows. And then, it's for me personally, I think it's a good approach.
Oh, thank you.
So let's go deeper into what terrain looks like from a food perspective. I like the fact that, everything wasn't just, you can eat this, you can eat that, but it was clean.
Yeah.
It was clean food. So there's a study I want to ask you about, the Marina, the Marinac trial. It was published in JAMA Oncology in 2016. Over 2,400, about 2,400 women. And the finding was that a 13-hour overnight fast, like just finishing dinner at about 7 p.m. and eating breakfast about 8 a.m., was associated with a 36% lower risk of breast cancer recurrence. No special diet, no supplements, just the timing. And I know you said we're going to talk about it. So how do you use that in your clinical practice?
Well, first of all, I find that food, as you well know, and I'm sure these conversations have come up and they should come up more, food it's a loaded topic. Right?
Yeah.
We can get very dogmatic about it. We can get into dietary wars of be vegan, be carnivore, be keto, be raw food. Like, I want people to let's just lay the foundation bare to the backbone of this. That food is often related to also self-control, self-soothing. It's very emotional. It's very relational. Pretty much everything. When you think about joyful occasions or joyful transitions in a person's life, food is involved, from births to weddings to funerals to everything in between is stamped with food. So thinking about that, what I loved about this study is it did not even ask these women what they were eating. They could have been eating Twinkies and Diet Coke all day. And the very fact that they stopped for a 13-hour or more window every day was what shined in the literature that had a huge lever. So by the way, this is free. This is a free treatment that made a major change. And so again, people like Dr. Sachin Panda's work in the circadian code showing that maybe the timing was having a role here. But what I also suggest is what I've already mentioned about the sensory input when we take a break from putting more information in, our body can deal with what's already there, whether it was good or bad, like however we qualify it, whether it was, a Twinkie or a piece of broccoli. That
Yeah.
body has the time to actually understand it and respond
Mhm.
to it. And so it
Mhm.
takes a huge burden off the system. You're not wasting energy trying to digest that or trying
Yeah.
to absorb that or trying to eliminate that. And that frees up a lot of stored energy to be used for other
Mhm.
things like healing,
Yeah.
immune surveillance, immune attack. Like this is what we're finding in the data was happening for these women is they were likely down regulating stimuli and up regulating responsiveness in the terrain around.
I like that the study was accessible. I like the fact that people were not put under the restraint of mentioning what you're taking or what is good or what is
Yeah.
not bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you do not need a prescription, you do not need a specialist. So the timing,
Yeah.
I would say you need a clock and a plate. So what else in the food cancer space as that kind of evidence behind it that patients are not hearing about? Maybe something they could look into.
Sure, sure. There's a book I'd recommend for folks who are intrigued by what we're talking about here. We were talking about like food and what it can do for you, but I've also alluded to the power of fasting and what that can do for you. And
Mm.
Dr. Walter Longo, who's a famous life longevity researcher, I started reading his work, gosh, back in the late 2000, like 2009, 2010, and started hearing him speaking at conferences 2011, 12, again, as the conversations around the metabolic mitochondrial drivers of cancer were starting to make their rounds. He too was making his rounds, suggesting in the research that he was seeing, not just in the US, but in Italy and other parts of the world, was that patients who fasted around the time of their standard of care treatments had better outcomes. Namely, because of the story we've been telling our patients since the late 1960s was no matter what, don't lose weight. The concept of fasting freaks everybody out, the doctors, the patients, caregivers, their family members, their loved ones. And what
Mm.
Dr. Longo was able to show was that, yes, they may initially in those 5 days, which is a
Mm.
5-day water fasting process, is how it started, by the way. Now he has a food as medicine, what they call a fasting mimicking diet program around it. His is called Prolon, and there's other knockoffs on the market as well. What he was able to show was that these patients may have initially dropped that weight. Most of it is because when you drop insulin, you drop salt. And when you drop salt, you drop water, right? So
Yeah.
basically, when salt leaves the building, so does fluid leave the building. So a lot of what you lose in those first few days of a water fast is actually water weight and tissue
Mhm.
inflammation in the tissue. So this kind of bogginess. So yes, that might look on a scale like you dropped a lot of weight, but interesting in his data over and over and over again for well over 10, 15 years now, is
Yeah.
that those same patients compared to patients who ate ad libitum, meaning don't make any changes in your diet, eat as much as you want, whenever you want, those patients who fasted 5 days around chemotherapy, they lost more weight initially, but they normalized and maintained way more robustly, like
Mhm.
drastically, statistically significantly so, compared to the patients who were told to eat whatever you want, just don't lose weight. Right.
Mm.
And so
Okay.
his book, he finally had his book come out. And he's lectured on this thousands and thousands of times, been on thousands of podcasts. That his really compelling scientific referenced book,
Yeah.
Fasting Cancer, came out in 2024. And it is a really good compendium for your folks who do want to do the deep dive into the research, who may be horrified by the idea of fasting around this. So that was a place that was really, really compelling. And what I will tell you as a clinician, my patients who fast around chemo or who fast around their radiation or targeted therapies, they have less side effects. They
Mm.
bounce back quicker
Mhm.
and they're able to maintain the timing of their therapies routinely throughout without needing to take a break because their bodies just can't cope with the treatment. And they
Mm.
often also need less of the bone marrow supporting drugs, et cetera, because we've also shown that simply a 3-day water fast will completely change your microbiome, which then completely changes your immune system, which then completely changes your marrow recovery. Do you
Mm.
catch what I'm stepping in here? Like
Yeah.
we're like hitting a domino effect when we
Mm.
do this. And
Yeah.
it's just incredibly profound. And even Dr. Longo's work has shown that even if you go into your chemotherapy only 13 to 16 hours fasted, you get benefit. And then to maintain it for another 13 to 16 hours after. So my patients who are getting more like weekly treatment, we consolidate that window. The patients that are getting every 3 or 4 week treatment, we try to, I don't even say try because they just do. I don't have problems with patients doing this. I know people are so terrified of it, but I've literally fasted tens of thousands of patients directly and indirectly around their chemotherapy over the past 15 years without any concern. But it's just incredible to me. The other piece around what and when we eat is, well, let me just take this back. What do you, I mean, Dr. Remi, maybe you've had this conversation with your listeners, but what is it that we're looking for when we look at a PET scan? So if folks think that this isn't a big deal, like I don't know how to impress you, but basically an FDG uptake PET scan, which is a positron imaging that utilizes an injection of radioactive glucose into the system. And then they're radiated to look through the building to see where there is glucose uptake. Wherever there is glucose uptake, there is active cancer. And so I don't know how doctors do not make that connection. It's so simple. The patients get it. Even what's crazy is they do give the patient a piece of paper and say, okay, you need to fast for at least 12 hours before your PET scan, but they don't explain why. They don't actually, like I have my patients actually fast 24 hours before a PET scan, and I have them carb restrict 48 to 72 hours before that. So we get a real read on the cancer and not the sugar you've been eating over the last few days, right? And so those are things that if that doesn't compel you, I don't know what will. And when a patient starts to understand that, they start to realize, well, geez, if I can starve it for a few days, what happens if I'm ongoing carb restricting? What happens if I'm ongoing? And I'll tell you, the literature shows without any, if anybody's questioning this today, it's because they literally have not bothered to pick up an article or two or 20,000 or 50,000 saying that most cancers are glycolytic in nature, meaning most cancers are glucose hogs. There's another fuel that can be taken up by cancer cells when the glucose stores are taken up, which is glutamine, which is what's liberated from the muscles. And basically every healthy cell of your body requires glutamine to survive, but the cancer can get greedy and start to steal it from those cells as well. So this is why fasting is such a powerful place, because then you don't have to worry about what you're eating. You just remove some of the potential drivers along the way. And so I put every patient with cancer on at the very least, a carb restricting diet, and we get them under 50 grams of carbohydrate. That's our goal. Some people need higher fat. Some people need higher protein. That is an individual decision based on the nature of the person's metabolic health to begin with, their pharmacogenomics, what treatments they're doing, what the goal of therapy is, and just their constitution. There's also a lot of other SNPs that help. So I'll give a quick example of this, Remi. So my husband and I been together for 35 years now, married for 25. The guy was crazy enough at 22 to fall in love with a dying 19-year-old from ovarian cancer, right? So we've been on this journey.
Great guy, yeah.
Right. And so we were on this journey. And just so your listeners know, I started out, actually, I was a vegetarian at the time of my diagnosis, but let me qualify that. I was a junk food vegetarian, right? I was a carbitarian, let's be real. And so then after I got diagnosed, the only thing back in 1991 I could read about was like the GERS diet and juicing and more vegan. And I did that and it almost killed me. I tried that really hard, really focused, really full force for about 5-6 years. And it almost killed me until a Chinese medicine doctor got his hands on my pulse, looked at my tongue, saw my constitution, felt the tumors in my body and said, you need to eat some animal protein or you're going to die. And I was really resistant. I was dogmatically resistant to that. And I still resisted it for another year until my liver ended up 21 centimeters below my rib cage and I was filled with metastatic disease. And I'm like, F it. Okay, I'll have an egg.
I'm going to listen to you now.
Right. And so for me, my first entree into the animal food world again was eggs. And it was like that first egg, I can tell you, Dr. Remi, for all the years I avoided it, it felt like the lights came on. I was like, well, that was interesting. Wow. And it took me a while. I went from eggs and over many months, I started bringing in some salmon. And after many months, I started bringing a little bit of dairy, like just slowly. Little by little, because I had to mentally be prepared for it. Looking back now, I understand. There are certain constitutions who do better on a more plant-forward diet. There are constitutions that do better on a more carnivore-forward diet. There are constitutions that do better on kind of an omnivore mixed diet. it's not a one size fits all. So I want people to be really clear on that. And so for me, I'm the person who could eat a pint of raspberries and nothing happens to my CGM, my continuous glucose monitor. My husband
Yeah.
eats two and his blood sugar
And
spikes,
it's on is
right?
is way
And
out of
yes, and I would love to not eat meat, but my ferritin levels, which is an iron storage level, were in the single digits my entire young adult life until I
wow.
started bringing on animal protein. Part of
Yeah.
that was I had severe leaky gut, tons of autoimmunity. And what we now know in the literature is somebody like me would probably have done well with like a short course of carnivore diet to heal my gut. I
Yeah.
couldn't do it. The mindset was too difficult for me, but I brought in small enough doses that worked for me.
For you.
And so the fact that I can live with the same person for all these years, our bodies need different things
Yeah.
and our
Yeah.
goals are different for how we nourish ourselves. We kind of have like our fundamentals, which is like the
Yeah.
base camp of high quality. We both do really well with vegetable forward, but good quality protein, kind of the next, and then good fats woven into that. And then we
Yeah.
do quite a bit of intermittent fasting or time restricted eating. And so I mention that because I think people get wrapped around the axle that there's one way to eat. But I think,
Mhm.
Remi, the message I want people to know, it's like the quality matters. I know my farmers and ranchers. We have a little garden right now in my backyard here in Mexico. I have a
Yeah.
papaya tree. I have a
Mm.
plantain tree. I have tons and tons of different herbs,
Yeah.
rosemary, basil, mint, hibiscus. I make my own hibiscus sun tea. We grow
Yeah.
tons of peppers and tomatoes. We grow radishes. We grow, greens. Like that's just in our little teeny tiny little
Yeah.
backyard. And looking out my window right now, I've got little planting hanging pots of different herbs that we use in culinary. So
Yeah.
it's not an excuse. Like you don't have to have money to have a couple little pots of plants in your house that you can eat from, or to
Yeah.
join a CSA, or to get your food stamps to be used at a farmer's market. Like this
Yeah.
is accessible to everybody today. There's no longer an excuse that we can't all eat well, local, seasonal, regional, and as clean as possible and as close to source as possible.
Yeah.
That alone, with a little bit of timing for good measure,
Yeah.
can and will make all the difference. And my other suggestion is folks be careful about being dogmatic about following any particular influencer or belief system. I just recently buried a friend of mine in this last week who was really famous for her work as a raw food vegan and has written books about it and the whole bit. And beautiful. And no one looked under the hood for her was, did that fit her mitochondrial
Body.
needs, right? Was she getting the right signals into the mix? Because somebody would look at her and assume, oh, she'll never get cancer. And she died from cancer. And so that's the place that we have to get out of our own way to say, I'm curious about how this is working or not working for me, and even curious about how it's working or not working for me in a given moment. Because our
Yeah.
needs change. Like
Yeah.
me as a 20 something with stage 4 ovarian cancer, my needs are different now as a almost 55-year-old postmenopausal woman, right?
Yeah.
Like I need different nourishment today to
Yeah.
stabilize my terrain than I
Yeah.
did at 20 to
Yeah.
stabilize my terrain.
Yeah, makes absolute sense. Our needs when we're younger is different when we're older. And I think it's important for listeners to have those conversations with their oncologist.
Yeah.
One size doesn't fit all,
Right.
basically, and I know that suffering from broccoli sprouts, polyphenols, the microbiome,
Oh, yeah.
immune axis.
Yeah.
These are not just fringe ideas. There's serious peer-reviewed science behind
Yes.
them. And
Yeah.
yet the conversation in most oncology appointments is still, here's your treatment plan.
Right. Right.
Here's your anti-nausea medication. Here's the
Yes.
number for the dietitian. So
Right.
if you want
Right.
it, not here's the food protocol that
Yes.
supports your treatment. So what do you wish? Because I
Sure.
can see your ego. What do you
I
wish
know.
every new
Get excited. Yeah.
I know every newly diagnosed patient knew about food in the first week after
Mm.
diagnosis before even treatment starts? What
I
would you
love,
like
well,
them to know?
really the only cure for cancer is prevention. Let's
Yeah.
just start there. So
Yeah.
I would love to be I would love to be doing preconception education for every parent looking to even conceive. Because the process of whether we're going to be healthy or diseased starts long before we're even a sparkle in somebody's eye. right? So
Yeah.
we want to make sure we are cleaning up mom and dad and giving them the nourishment they want. There was an interesting study several years ago about what your father ate has complete direct impact as to what diseases you'll have in your lifetime. So those things we need to become more mindful to realize. So I would love to see an entire field of medicine as preconception medicine, preconception counseling. Number two, as I've already alluded to, and for the next, it'll probably take another generation before doctors are coming out into the marketplace that have had any education in nutrition. So don't ask your oncologist because they will tell you eat anything and just whatever you do, don't lose weight. They're not experts. Just like you shouldn't ask me about how to work on your car, right? Please don't ask a currently trained oncologist about your nutrition. I also want to really, and this is no disrespect to RDs because registered dietitians, I understand why they get into it. Their heart is in the right place. What they don't understand is they've been brainwashed and they've been completely held hostage by industry. They're allowed to talk about you get just enough vitamin C to prevent scurvy. You get just enough vitamin D to prevent osteomalacia or rickets. You get just enough of this. None of it is therapeutic. None of it is preventative. And most of what they're taught is frankly a line of BS from the industry. Where I want folks to know is to get good, sound scientific nutrition advice, you need to seek a therapeutic trained nutritionist. Period. You won't get it. Now, most nutritionists who are therapeutic trained nutritionists are what we call recovering RDs. Okay? They started out as RDs and they realized very quickly the limitations. Yeah. And they knew they needed to get more. They wanted to use food, as Dr. Remi is having this whole podcast about, as medicine. RD nutritionists have never been trained how to use food as medicine. In fact, when you look at the tray for a diabetic patient in the hospital, it's freaking malpractice. And that was put together by an RD nutritionist. And they, on average, have 150 to 300 grams of carbohydrate on those plates that are told this is a diabetic-friendly diet. Don't listen to those people, right? This is where you get yourself an oncology nutritionist. There's only one course so far. There's a new one starting out of the UK. But there's only one course that has board accreditation for nutritionists specifically trained in oncology, and that is Oncology Nutrition Institute. And in full transparency, Jess Higgins, who was the founder of that institute, was my co-author for the Metabolic Approach to Cancer. We saw again and again the need to educate people properly in the use of nutrition. I get nothing for saying this. I don't get a kickback, nothing. I've been on her board of advisors and I've been a faculty member over the years, but I'm not currently doing either of those things. But you want to work with someone who has therapeutic nutrition training. There's other schools out there that teach therapeutic nutrition qualifications. Most of them require some form of medical background. Most of them require an RD as the base. So think about like an RD nutritionist as kindergarten. Think about a therapeutic nutritionist as high school or college, and think about an oncology nutrition trained nutritionist as a postgraduate expert. So that's something very important. I know I'm going to get a lot of hate mail for this, Dr. Remi, but I don't care. Because this isn't about me. This is about saving lives. And this is about doing better. And my hope, if there's an RD who's pissed off listening to this, you'll get curious and you'll realize how sabotaged your own understanding is about how to actually help your patients. So I'm going to challenge them to do better because we need them. We need a lot of them because you're the ones who need to help these doctors get their 40 hours of training in the future when that starts to become part of the program. So I tell you guys that because there is more misinformation about nutrition in general, and especially nutrition specific to cancer, that I'm literally stamping out fires every single day in this category. Some of the biggest lies are the juicing recommendations. So, and then we'll come back to your getting into the polyphenols here. But for instance, I was a big juicer until we realized that when we concentrate, when we put in like a cup of spinach is one thing, but when you take 6 cups and juice it, you're concentrating all the chemicals from the soil that those foods are chelating out. So I can't even tell you how many times I've watched glyphosate levels, which is known carcinogen, come from patients who are doing what they think is doing good by juicing things like cucumbers and spinach that are just piling in cups and cups of that, which concentrates the chemicals, right? So let's just keep that in mind, that that's one of the things. It also is terrible on the blood sugar. Even if it's a low carb vegetable, you're putting a lot of just water soluble nutrients with no fiber in there, which will spike the blood sugar. So you have to be
No.
careful of that. But to Dr. Remy's point that there are foods that have ample evidence of being medicinal. Let's talk about Dr. Argaval, who was at MD Anderson for many, many moons and finally left because he was so tired of being targeted by pharma for his work, where he was able to show that turmeric, curcumin and curcuminoids, the active components of turmeric, was just as effective in the treatment of breast cancer cell lines as Taxotere, the taxanes, which are the chemotherapy of choice for breast cancer for many of these. And so he was, and then people started to say he was falsifying his data. They had a witch hunt on him. Yet labs across the globe confirmed and replicated his studies time and time again. He finally just retired and took care of himself. He has a beautiful book. Dr. Argaval has a beautiful book on herbs for cancer and herbs for health in general, which goes into these components. Dr. Barry Boyd is a famous oncologist who's done entire decades and decades of study on the constituents of herbs and food as chemotherapeutic agents. So we know that certain categories, polyphenols, which are coming from, your bright, like your berries and whatnot, like these are the things that have an anti-cancer effect. The things like from your citrus and your citrus peels, the limonene have direct cytotoxic activity on your cancer cells. The fiber helps you bind up all of the exogenous estrogens and xenotoxins and metals and pull them out of the building so they don't populate parts of the body where they shouldn't be. These are the types of things. And then the certain foods like the sulforaphanes, these are what help you maintain and protect and support and heal your DNA, your vitamin A, not from plants. Beta carotene can actually be a carcinogen. You got to be careful with that. But the vitamin A from animal foods, specifically animal fats, like the backstrap, the eggs, different things like that, that is the anti-cancer vitamin A. In fact, I'll really go on a limb here because a lot of people fight me about the vegan discussion. Now, there's never been a culture in human history that ever naturally gravitated to a vegan diet, period. Right? I want to tell you all something here. Now, there's definitely cultures out there with vegetarianism, long lineage of that, but they also eat a lot more sugar today than they did for generations past. But what is classically missing in every single patient I've ever cared for, metrics, not guesswork, is in every cancer patient, they're missing B12, they're missing vitamin D, vitamin A, vitamin K, selenium, zinc, magnesium, and vitamin D. And I think I might have repeated one of those, but they're missing critical pieces. Guess who else is missing those critical pieces? Our vegan and our vegetarian population. And so, yes, you can get B12 from things like spirulina, but you're not getting a bioavailable one. You're getting a cyanocobalamin form of it, which is not as bioavailable and actually can have toxic effects to your healthy cells. Just like, yes, you can get vitamin D, but you're getting the D2 form from mushrooms. That too is not bioavailable and it has a high toxicity profile. The place we've all evolved from, every one of us on this planet, since the beginning of human nature to today, we ate animals, even small amounts, right? Whether it was an egg or some dairy, bugs. I just came from Oaxaca, spending 10 days in Oaxaca. They eat crickets like crazy and grasshoppers like crazy at every meal. Like huge amounts. And actually, we all ate a lot of insects because we weren't overly purifying our food sources. So that was another source of chitosan and other sources of protein. But what happens if I do have someone who's really staunchly connected to a vegan diet? First of all, I just never recommend that. I'm just going to be harsh again because you're too malnourished of that. If folks really want to be a vegetarian, I can absolutely work with that, but you will have to take a fish oil. You will have to take an animal-derived vitamin D, and you will have to take an animal-derived B12. You're going to have your conversations with God about that, right? Because I do not believe God put these things on our planet for us not to need to access. And so you can do well as a vegetarian if you properly nourish yourself, but it's very difficult to do so. Yes, you can get your protein needs met, but it comes at the cost of carb loading. So to get your 60 to 100 grams of protein a day as a vegetarian, you need to eat about 2 to 3 times of that of carbohydrate. And remember, patients with cancer, we need to be keeping your carbohydrate intake under 50 grams. So you'll starve to death if you don't get enough protein. So that's why being willing to have an egg or piece of fish is very helpful for this. And I can hear Dr. Dang screaming at me all those years ago, like, Nasha, you're going to die if you let your dogma run the show, And so, yes, I understand. And we can test. We can test for this. It's not, if you don't believe me, get curious and look under the hood of your own vehicle.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. It's a lot of, maybe you would introduce me to some of these doctors so they can get
I
on the
would
show.
love that. I would
And
love that.
yeah. So this is a piece I want people to write down, especially if you have cancer. Look for an integrative nutritionist, oncologist nutritionist. I'm correct, right?
Yes.
So this
Or
is
at
not
least a
a,
therapeutic
yeah.
nutritionist who knows how to use food as medicine.
Yes, yes. And it's not a wellness trend. I don't want people to look at it that way. There's clinical evidence. So let's talk about lifestyle piece,
Mm,
because food is one pillar, but it's not the only one,
yeah.
right?
Thank
And
you for
so
that.
we talk about 10 terrain factors in your book. Food is one, but I want to spend a few minutes on the ones that often get overlooked. We don't think about it. That's
Yeah.
sleep. We're going to talk about it. Stress, the
Yeah.
circadian rhythm, because there's emerging research on chronotherapy. The idea that when you take a medication matters.
Yeah.
It matters as much as what you take. So as a pharmacist, that fascinates me. So what does the evidence say about circadian rhythm and cancer treatments?
Sure. This is such fascinating work. And actually, Dr. Remi, there's been so many decades of research in this concept known as chronobiology of the
Mm,
timing of when you take certain medications because of the timing of the rhythms within your own cells. Okay.
mm,
We've had a lot of data on this, and yet it's not very actionable in a boxed medical system. Right. So
mm,
the idea
mm,
of giving somebody something like 5-FU in the 10 o'clock in the morning window, which is where it's most efficacious, where it will target the cancer the best at a
mm,
particular cell cycle of that cancer process while being less detrimental to the healthy cells around it.
yeah.
Not every patient on the planet getting 5-FU can get that treatment at 10 a.m.,
Mm,
right? Or the same
mm,
being true of things like carboplatin, which is one of the platinum drugs or the most common used drugs in oncology. That's an evening dose. Most
yeah.
clinics, most hospitals are done doing their drip by 5 p.m. And
Yeah.
that's the window when it's going to do its best job. There's
Mm,
someone who's done some really amazing work in this arena in Chicago, Dr. Keith Block. He's kind of considered the father of integrative oncology. And he has been like, he literally it looks kind of like a little oxygen pack,
mm,
has the chemo, and he sends patients home, and it's tied to a port or a PIC line that
yeah.
is set to go off at the proper time of when that chemotherapy is most utilized, most able to be utilized.
Yeah.
So, and then he even does things like, which I love, is that one things we know is cancer becomes very impenetrable to whatever you're trying to target with it, especially over time,
Mm,
right? So
mhm,
we
mhm.
want to we want to make it porous. So whatever treatment we're bringing on is getting to our desired target and not then bouncing off of it and causing a shrapnel effect to the healthy
Yeah.
tissue around. So
Mhm,
people like
mhm,
Dr. Keith Block and others have learned that if you oxygenate the body or you
mhm,
move the circulation before you give the therapies like Taxols or Platinums or 5-FUs, you actually increase the uptake of those treatments to the tumor
mm.
and diminish the impact on the healthy cells around it. So I have been in Keith Block's clinic to see patients on treadmills or bikes or rowing machines hooked up to their chemo pump, working out with their chemo.
So
My
that's the
job,
move.
isn't that brilliant? And I would have patients go and take a walk around the block really briskly or go sit in the far infrared sauna. Or for things like radiation, we prime the radiation pump, if you will, with oxygen, whether it's hyperbaric
Mhm,
oxygen, rectal insufflation, blow by oxygen, because oxygen radiosensitizes our cancer
mm,
cells. So
mm,
if they
mm.
can't get access to those tools, a good brisk walk or some good buteyko breathing or something that's going to really invigorate your breath work will
Yeah.
potentize the radiation therapy. These are things that I'm telling you, they sound so esoteric and woo woo, and yet they're all so well documented, but they
Yeah.
don't fit into the standard of care model in the box of,
Mm,
you get your treatment at this time for whatever this schedule is available to the doctor to see you,
yeah.
blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah. When we as patients can learn and be empowered on how to harness the power of that treatment better. If you
Yeah.
know you're someone taking 5-FU, set your treatments for morning
Yeah.
as close to that
So
window as possible. If you're someone taking a platinum, set it for as late in the day as possible, as
yeah.
example.
So let me reiterate what you just said. F 5-FU is more effective at 8 to 10 o'clock in the morning, right? 6% show better outcomes in the evening, late afternoon, in the evening. So the clock on the wall is definitely part of the prescription, and yet almost no oncology protocol accounts for that. So
Right.
what about sleep? Because we know
Mm,
cortisol dysregulation, melatonin suppression,
Yes.
immune function, they are all tied to sleep quality. So how does that interact with cancer biology?
Sure. Well, I mean, my goodness, on so many levels. Again, where we thought like mitochondria just made it ATP, we always thought melatonin just helped us sleep. We now understand melatonin is also like a master switch in all circadian biology, in all redox. So reactive oxygen species quenching and antioxidation, as well as pro-oxidants in certain times and places that we need it. It's also a natural hormone modulator. So it has natural tendencies to be a SERM, which is a selective estrogen receptor modifier, or an AI, an aromatase inhibitor, and even shows to have SERD effects, which is another a sort of endocrine therapy disruptor that we try to use in a lot of our hormone positive cancers today. Melatonin is powerful, right? And so it is an inverse relationship to light and to serotonin. So if you are someone who is not sleeping or you're a night owl and you've always just said, oh, I'm just a night owl, that's the way it is, I'd like you to rethink that if you're dealing with cancer, right? You got to retrain yourself. Because if you're up at night, especially in front of blue light, you are absolutely quenching any ability for you to make melatonin. So basically, if you're not in bed asleep by 10 p.m., wherever you are, your melatonin levels are suffering, which means your redox processes are suffering, your DNA repair is suffering, your circadian rhythm suffering, your hormone modulation, and your metabolic response. So like your insulin response is suffering. Then if you're like, then you may go, well, I still get my 8 hours of sleep, but I go to bed at 2 p.m. or 2 a.m. and get up at 10 a.m. When you are not up in those first hours, in that first hour of the sun coming up, getting that red light, which is absolutely telling through the eyes, through the pineal gland, through this part of your skull here, that it's a cascade and a wash of chemicals to your body saying, this is where you do your job. This is where you clean up. So light and dark make a difference. And so this also brings up, and we won't have time to probably discuss this now, but my shift workers, we have to really work hard because the reality is a lot of people have to work shift. It just is. I had to work shifts for many years. I was in shift work at the time of my diagnosis, and I stayed there for the first couple of years, and it was very difficult to get into remission. I'll just tell you that right now. It's not impossible, but it takes a lot more work. You have to work with someone who knows how to work with your circadian rhythm and with melatonin physiology and with serotonin physiology, right? These are opposite. Serotonin's high, melatonin's low. Melatonin's high, serotonin's low. This is the sleep-wake cycle. Light up, melatonin down. Light down, melatonin up. Those are the things, like simply put, to look at the rhythm of that. So when we have a night or two of disrupted sleep, happens for the best of us, you will, in fact, spike your insulin levels. Therefore, you will spike something called insulin growth factor, which is the main proliferating factor of cancer cells out there in over 80% of all cancer types. So getting your sleep dialed is critical. So then I think about people who are in shift work. I think about people who have new babies, right? I think about people who have certain stressors, or they've got a lot of light pollution in their house or their bedroom. These are people, like, no wonder, and Dr. Remi, we didn't even talk about this yet, but today, it is expected that 1 in 2 of us are going to meet this diagnosis in our lifetime. And what you and I have talked about during this hour together so far explains why we're all coming to this potential diagnosis, because our terrain in, on, and around us is terribly, terribly dysregulated. And the things we have power over is what's at the end of our fork or what's not on the plate at different times when we're eating, of what we're being exposed to with light and dark cycles, and of really working on changing our sleep patterns intentionally. And if you're having a difficulty falling asleep, that's an example of metabolic syndrome. That's a blood sugar problem. If you're having problems staying asleep, say waking up in the early hours, that's a cortisol problem. You need to work with someone who can help you correct those problems, because sleep, I call it the 4 S's: sugar, sleep, stress, and sex. Okay, so sugar, there's the insulin piece. Sex, there's the cortisol piece. Sex, there's your hormones. That could be all of them: pituitary, thyroid, or gonads, and sleep. So sleep biology is those 4 S's. If you tend to all 4 of those S's diligently, you're going to be really hard to kill. Okay, like simply put. And so I also call it the CDC, my version of the CDC. So circadian rhythm, diet, and community, because community can be the balm to all of this. Because guess what? Really erratic hormonal metabolic dysfunction can be soothed with a beautiful hormone called oxytocin. And oxytocin is the hormone of connection. And in our world today, like even having this conversation, I can imagine there are people listening that are very triggered by this or scared even. You reach out for help. You get support to make these subtle changes that even if they're small, they're mighty. And so that community aspect creates a flood of oxytocin into the cells, which regulates all those other three S's beautifully.
Interesting. I do want to be honest with our listeners. When I was in pharmacy school, we did not talk about any of this. We talked about pharmacokinetics, drug interactions, dosing. We did not talk about the time of day a drug is most effective. Yes, maybe statins, some of them at bedtime when you go to bed, but the role of sleep in immune surveillance or what chronic stress does to the terrain, we didn't do that. So that is a gap in our training. And I think we're slowly closing, but slowly. So what is the most underrated lifestyle intervention you see in your clinical practice that patients are not doing?
Well, I think there's two, actually. One of them is when we're eating. So I think if you could all, like from the studies that have come out and from my own experience, if every single person on the planet ate had a 13-hour fast, from finishing, like you said, 7 p.m. and not eating until 8 a.m. And water only in the interim, we would have a major shift. But I will tell you, the vast majority of people can't even do that. So if you can't yet, maybe you aim for 8 hours. And once you master that, then aim for 9. Once you master that, then aim for 10. Do it at the pace that's right for you. But eventually make it just, I don't eat for 13 hours every day, and just keep it that way. Then if you want to really get crazy and push it a little bit, maybe a couple times a week, go a little bit longer, maybe a 16-hour once or twice a week. And for my patient population dealing with cancer, we do the 13-hour every day, a 16 to 18-hour once or twice a week, and a 3-day, 72-hour once a month. And then once or twice a year, we do a 5 to 10-day water fast. Now that is under more medical supervision, but that is where even people like the most famous oncology researchers, longevity researchers will say that if we all got privy to how to fast for 5 to 10 days a year or twice a year, we would eliminate most of the chronic conditions we have today. And that's from the work from every longevity researcher, cancer researcher, chronic illness researcher, dementia researcher. It's universal across the board. And so that to me is really, really fascinating. And then the second piece that's also very easy is light. So my non-negotiable, because I travel a lot for work, is I make sure I know the time of sunrise wherever I'm staying. And I say always, because even if I went to bed at 4 a.m., I'm up at 5 to watch that sunrise wherever I am, right? To see it, because it's such a signal input to those mitochondria and tells my body what to do for the rest of the day and days to come. And then I also do my darndest to see a sunset. And even if I can't see it directly on the horizon either time, being outdoors or exposing yourself to the light, even in a cloudy day, of the first light of the day and the last light of the day, is one of the most potent signaling agents we can put into our body. And that does help you process whatever foods you are eating, timing wise and quality wise. And that does help you process how much you and how well you sleep. And that does help you process your hormone regulation and how your brain is working and all the things. Like those are fundamental, simple things that should be like ubiquitous, right? And they're not even close.
Yeah. So two things I want listeners to listen to: the sun, or getting the sunlight when you wake up, or when the sun is out and when the sun sets. You don't have to pay for that. The fasting bit, start from very little, 8 hours, very little, something that is doable. So you don't, because when we start so high, it's very easy to kind of like, nah, I can't do this. We start little. So we're going to move into the pharmacy side of this, because I want to talk about the interactions that most oncology patients are never warned about. They're never told. So I'm going to start with, I want to bring in the pharmacist's perspective here, because this is where food and medicine literally collide. Grapefruit. It is on the interaction list for over 85 medications, including several chemotherapy agents, including, I think, imatinib, elotinib, josatinib. The reason is cytochrome 3A4, an enzyme in the gut, and that it metabolizes this drug. So grapefruits inhibits that enzyme. it blocks it in a way, which means the drug builds up higher than your intended levels in the blood. And this
Yeah.
is not a minor
Nope.
interaction. It could be, quite toxic. So how do you see patients who are eating grapefruit or drinking grapefruit juice while
Yeah.
on treatment?
Yeah. Well, I live down here in Mexico. And so taranga, which is grapefruit juice, or naranja, are at every single breakfast here. Like, it is just a given. You see it on every table. I'm in the land of citrus. Citrus grows on trees everywhere down here. Every
Yeah,
market, every little fruteria sells, grapefruit. And
grapefruit.
so the question clinicians, nutritionists, patients, or family members should be asking is, what did you eat in the last 24 hours? So we maintain a diet diary for the clients that we work with, so
Yeah.
we can understand that. And also, like, for instance, like biotin is a really good example. If someone's taking a supplement of biotin, I need them to stop it for a few days before they run thyroid panels, for instance, because it can interact with that. It can give you false information. Or if they've just taken a bunch of vitamin C before a poop test, right? It can give you an erroneous positive for for a problem, like a scary problem. It could look like colorectal cancer. So we want to know what people are taking. We want to know what they're eating in those 24 hours. And to
Yeah.
your point of the P450 enzyme pathways, some of us are slow metabolizers. Some of us are fast metabolizers of things. Some of us are moderate
Yeah.
metabolizers. So this is what's so cool is, since your career, Dr. Remi, and since mine in the last, I'd say 15, 20 years, I run pharmacogenomics on every patient I work with because I want to know what their blind spots are. And I'm usually the one educating their doctor, right? On, hey, you have to be careful with these interactions. Like CYP2D6, for instance, these are patients that have no business. If they've got SNPs there, they should not be on SSRIs. They should not be on blood thinners. They should not be on beta blockers. So remember that the third leading cause of death in the United States is a properly prescribed medication. And if we actually just took that extra teeny tiny, relatively low cost test to screen every single patient to have it in their medical file of what their pharmacogenomics are, we would save a lot of people, right? So there are people who have SNPs to salicylates, which is, of course, an aspirin, but it's also in a lot of foods. We have patients who have who are rapid metabolizers of certain pharmaceuticals. There's a lot of people using things called tamoxifen in cancer treatment, and yet about 70% of patients don't metabolize it appropriately. So basically what happens if we're slow or fast metabolizers, we can either shoot the response out too quickly, or, right, like too fast, like, well, that didn't do anything. Or we back it up and it becomes hyper expressive and hyper toxic. And so it's a narrow window. And as a pharmacist, you know this, you know that this is a big deal. And so asking the question of what did you eat before? Because the other thing is, like, beets can throw things off, certain because you can see
Supplement.
supplements are the biggie. So we want to make sure we're testing the right things with folks. So asking the question, what did you eat in the last 24 hours? Asking the question of what supplements have you taken over the last 72 hours, or even medications, helps us understand what conflicts or contraindications or exacerbations of symptoms or side effects could exist. And so it's not even just one, because when you mentioned the CYP3A4, that is in 70% of patients have some little hiccup to some varying degree, from minor to major reactions. And so that a grapefruit could literally make or break their life, and it can really impede upon that. So it's some simple questions, which I still am always shocked that it's not really being asked, or explain to the patient why you don't want to mix grapefruit in your diet right now, why you may not want to have alcohol with this particular thing, or why you may not want to use, like, if your liver is already under a lot of burden, maybe a lot of curcumin or a lot of green tea extract is not a good idea because it can spike those liver enzymes more. Or maybe while your kidney function is a little depressed and not working great, maybe taking what the influencers are telling you to take with high doses of creatine isn't a great idea right now. They can worsen the picture or confuse the picture, even if it's not a physiologic problem. People may be erroneously treating you. Like, for example, high dose IV vitamin C. When you do a blood glucose before an IVC drip, we're looking for the patient to get a 350 to a 450 point difference between the starting glucose and the finishing glucose. And
Yeah.
people will kind of freak out. If you're getting an IV of high dose IV vitamin C above 25 grams, that is an effect that ascorbic acid, the vitamin C, looks very much through a glucose monitor like
Mm.
glucose. It's not. And so there was actually a case recently that anybody trained in integrated medicine should know better, that you have to run a G6PD to know if they are going to hemolyze high
Yeah.
doses of that, or that you need to understand the glucose response is not a true glucose response. We've had people who have died from being given insulin sitting
Yeah.
in the IV chair when they see their blood sugar is like 450 and they're thinking, oh, sheesh, this person's going to go into a diabetic coma.
Yeah.
No, you kill them when you give them insulin at that point. This is a transient effect in a monitor within a device that can't differentiate between ascorbic acid and glucose. And so we need to train people in that. We get the same type of thing with other nutrients and other food interactions, drug food interactions, drug nutrient interactions, drug herb interactions. We have to be very mindful. And so like for me, when I'm prepping patients for a surgery or something, I'm making sure their clotting cascade is being well reviewed. I'm making sure we're pulling those things out of the mix at least 72 hours before surgery so they don't bleed out on the table. Like this is the weirdest thing is studies show that over 88% of patients are using some form of quote unquote alternative therapy going through cancer treatment. And yet less than 20% of them will tell their clinicians, their conventional oncology team that they're doing this, which means they're putting themselves at risk, but also their clinicians at risk if they're not saying, hey, by the way, I was just on high dose IV vitamin C an hour ago. Please don't treat my blood sugar as true blood sugar. Like this is a communication problem, right? We all got to come to the table together
and talk your supplements. Your doctor has to know everything you're taking, because most times they cannot treat you if they don't have a full picture. And I know that's why exactly I built MediMeal Safe, because patients are taking food and supplement decisions every day without knowing how these decisions interact with their medications. And they're not doing it recklessly. They're doing it because nobody told them.
Right.
So the information is not in just one place. It's scattered across inserts, sometimes research papers, clinical databases, but most patients would never see. So what I hear you saying is that integrative oncology is not about replacing conventional treatments. It is about making it work better.
Yes.
Making the patient stronger going into it and through it. That's fair, right? That's a fair summary.
It's a beautiful summary. Yep. Spot on.
Yeah. So that is the frame I want every listener to carry out of this episode. Not the food instead of chemo, no, not supplements instead of surgery, but what is the terrain? How do we optimize it so that everything else you're doing has the best possible chance of working for you? So I'm about to close out. There's a place where we call rapid fire round. I do want Dr. Nasha to do this.
Okay.
I'm going to ask you a few questions, and the first thing that comes into mind, you're going to answer that.
I'm ready.
One food that cancer patients should eat every day.
Not just one. Just think what's local, seasonal, regional, close to the source as possible.
Okay. One food they should eliminate immediately.
Anything processed. If it's made in a factory, don't eat it.
Okay. Grapefruit. How do you explain it to a patient in one sentence?
I think you did a good job. But I think about grapefruit as just turning off a switch in your gut wall so that your medication can climb higher than your doctor ever prescribed.
What is the most underrated supplement in integrative oncology and the most overrated supplement?
I love it. The most underrated for me are sunlight and sleep, which would point to vitamin D and melatonin. Okay. And the most overrated are basically whatever is trending in the $90 a bottle influencer world of the day.
Okay, you put it nicely. Okay, best time of the day to eat your largest meal.
This is going to depend on you. So for me, I would like to have in my chemistry, one morning would be my preference, but I'm married to a man whose love language is cooking and he loves to cook dinner. So for me, I get more benefit out of his love language interacting with my mitochondria than me trying to force me eating in a particular window that I would like to eat in instead.
So makes sense. I like that. One lifestyle change that is more powerful than most people realize.
And I think we've talked a lot about this, but I think basically close your kitchen for 13 hours overnight. Dinner at 7, breakfast at 8, no kit, no coach, no course, and it just moved breast cancer recurrence by a third.
Thank you. Warburg effect in one sentence, like you explained to a 10-year-old. One sentence, 10-year-old.
Okay, I'll try. Here we go. So cancer cells are greedy and they're sloppy and they gobble up sugar for fuel even when they don't need it. And that's the mess that we are working on trying to slow down with the work we do.
Good. I like that. Very easy.
Yeah.
One thing you wish every oncologist knew about nutrition.
What's on the end of your fork matters, and changing, and also it changes how your drugs work. I'm saying that to the oncologist, for better or for worse. And right now, almost nobody is asking that question.
Very important. If you could give every newly diagnosed patient one sentence of advice, what would it be?
You are not a passenger on this journey. You are in the driver's seat. So please get curious, become the lead investigator of your own case, and find people who are properly trained to partner with you instead of handing over your verdict, handing over your power.
I love your answers so much.
Aww.
Very practical. I like the fact that pick food where you are. There's always something.
Yeah.
I like the fact that you are the driver to your life. You take ownership of what you have to do. And I'm going to be thinking about this all week because I have to make changes. I learn from every episode, and I think people need to bring it home, bring it to their homes. Before I go, I want to give you the last word. If there's one message you want someone living with cancer right now, someone who is to take away from this conversation, what would it be?
I think it's pretty simple. I really want people to recognize that they are far more powerful than they have been led to believe, and to get curious, because cancer is simply a messenger. It's not a death sentence.
And here's what I hope everyone takes away from season 1 of When Food Meets Medicine. When we started this season with a simple premise that food and medicine are not separate. They're not separate conversations. They are the same. They're the same conversations that we need to have. It's happening in the same body at the same time. And over now 12 episodes, we've heard that truth from pharmacists, from a specialist, from an oncologist, from a diabetes doctor, a GLP-1 expert, and they all say the same. Food is important. We're hearing from a naturopathic oncologist who has been living proof of our own work for 30 years, over 30 years. So this insight I want to leave with you today is this. In the Marinac trial, 2,400 women published in JAMA Oncology, a 13-hour overnight fast was associated with a 36% lower risk of breast cancer recurrence. So finish dinner at 7, eat breakfast at 8. That is it. No prescription required. That is the power of food as medicine. So, Dr. Nasha, I want to thank you so much for being here. Where can people find you, your book, and your work?
Well, thank you so much. What an absolute delight. You have asked incredible questions. So grateful for that, and grateful to hear season 2 as well. People can find me at drnasha.com, drnasha.com. You can also check out my podcast, Tend the Terrain, which you can follow. I also have a Substack by the same name, free. Both of those are free to follow. And I even have a free questionnaire on my website. I've got 2, actually. One is about what to do, the first 5 steps to do after you're diagnosed with cancer, that people can download and explore, and also a little simple questionnaire about exploring and tending your own terrain. And then, of course, Dr. Remi mentioned I have several books out there. My Metabolic Approach to Cancer book, a book called Mistletoe and the Emerging Future of Integrative Oncology, and recently a very simple ebook called Tend the Terrain, and all about the terrain 10 drivers that can make or break a health creation or destruction. So I'd love to see you all there.
Thank you. So to everyone who's been with us for season 1, thank you. You're the reason this show exists. Season 2 is coming, and it's going to go even deeper. If you have not subscribed yet, please do. And if this episode moved you, share it. Share with someone who's navigating a cancer diagnosis. Share with their caregiver. Share with their oncologist, because it does matter. And one more thing before we go. If today's conversation has you thinking about how food and your medications work together, I wrote a book on exactly that too. It's called Foods That Clash with Your Prescription, and it's a practical guide to understanding food and drug interactions in everyday life. If you want a structured way to start eating around your medications right now, the MediMeal plan at pharmaplansystems.com was built for that. It takes the guesswork out of what you eat when you're on medication. So both are in the show notes. You see them there. Until season 2, it's smart. Your meds matter. Your body will love you for it. Take care, everyone.